Do you know the story of the first Pharaoh of Egypt? According to Wikipedia, meaning harsh catfish or fierce catfish, was an ancient Egyptian pharaoh of the early dynastic period. He was the successor to the proto-dynastic King Ka. Many scholars consider him the unifier of Egypt and founder of the first dynasty, and in turn the first non-mythical king of a unified Egypt. He also had a prominently noticeable presence in Canaan compared to his predecessors and successors. Now, I will show you how these historical facts can be found and proven in Scripture. For this, we will take a look at the Book of Jasher. The Book of Jasher was originally a part of the 1611 King James Bible until it was removed by the Catholic Church. The Book of Jasher is referenced in the Bible, Joshua chapter 10 verse 13 KJV. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the Book of Jasher? Now, let's read. Book of Jasher, chapter 14, verses 1 through 2. In those days there was, in the land of Shinar, a wise man who had understanding in all wisdom, and of a beautiful appearance. But he was poor and indigent. His name was Ricain, and he was hard set to support himself. And he resolved to go to Egypt, to Oswiris the son of Anam, king of Egypt, to show the king his wisdom, for perhaps he might find grace in his sight, to raise him up and give him maintenance. And Ricain did so. Now, as you can see here in the first two verses, why it is said, he also had a prominently noticeable presence in Canaan compared to his predecessors and successors. Ricain is from the land of Shinar, which is modern-day Iraq, and ancient Babylon, which is in the land of Canaan. This is during the time of Nimrod, in history known as Gilgamesh, as well as the time of the biblical Abraham. Okay, let's keep going. Book of Jasher, chapter 14, verses 3 through 16. And when Ricain came to Egypt, he asked the inhabitants of Egypt concerning the king. And the inhabitants of Egypt told him the custom of the king of Egypt. For it was then the custom of the king of Egypt that he went from his royal palace, and was seen abroad only one day in the year. And after that the king would return to his palace to remain there. And on the day when the king went forth, he passed judgment in the land, and every one having a suit came before the king that day to obtain his request. And when Ricain heard of the custom in Egypt, and that he could not come into the presence of the king, he grieved greatly and was very sorrowful. And in the evening Ricain went out and found a house in ruin, formerly a bakehouse in Egypt. And he abode there all night in bitterness of soul and pinched with hunger, and sleep was removed from his eyes. And Ricain considered within himself what he should do in the town until the king made his appearance, and how he might maintain himself there. And he rose in the morning and walked about, and met in his way those who sold vegetables and various sorts of seed with which they supplied the inhabitants. And Ricain wished to do the same in order to get a maintenance in the city. But he was unacquainted with the custom of the people, and he was like a blind man among them. And he went and obtained vegetables to sell them for his support. And the rabble assembled about him and ridiculed him, and took his vegetables from him and left him nothing. And he rose up from there in bitterness of soul, and went sighing to the bakehouse in which he had remained all the night before. And he slept there the second night. And on that night again he reasoned within himself how he could save himself from starvation. And he devised a scheme how to act. And he rose up in the morning and acted ingeniously, and went and hired 30 strong men of the rabble, carrying their war instruments in their hand. And he led them to the top of the Egyptian sepulchre, and he placed them there. And he commanded them, saying, Thus saith the king, Strengthen yourselves and be valiant men. And let no man be buried here until 200 pieces of silver be given, and then he may be buried. And those men did according to the order of Ricain to the people of Egypt the whole of that year. And in 8 months' time Ricain and his men gathered great riches of silver and gold. And Ricain took a great quantity of horses and other animals. And he hired more men, and he gave them horses, and they remained with him. And when the year came round, at the time the king went forth into the town, all the inhabitants of Egypt assembled together to speak to him concerning the work of Ricky and his men. Now, we see that prior to Pharaoh, the land of Egypt had a king, which is why Wikipedia cites he was the successor to the proto-dynastic King Ka. Let's continue reading. Book of Jasher, chapter 14, verses 17 through 33. And the king went forth on the appointed day, and all the Egyptians came before him and cried unto him, saying, May the king live forever. What is this thing that is in the town to thy servant? Not to suffer a dead body to be buried until so much silver and gold be given. Was there ever the like unto this done in the whole earth? From the days of former kings, yea, even from the days of Adam, unto this day, that the dead should not be buried only for a set price. We know it to be the custom of kings to take a yearly tax from the living, but thou dost not only do this, but from the dead also thou exactest a tax day by day. Now, O king, we can no more bear this, for the whole city is ruined on this account, and dost thou not know it? And when the king heard all that they had spoken, he was very wroth, and his anger burned within him at this affair, for he had known nothing of it. And the king said, Who and where is he that dares to do this wicked thing in my land without my command? Surely you will tell me. And they told him all the works of Ricaon and his men, and the king's anger was aroused. And he ordered Ricaon and his men to be brought before him. And Ricaon took about 1,000 children, sons and daughters, and clothed them in silk and embroidery. And he set them upon horses and sent them to the king by means of his men. And he also took a great quantity of silver and gold and precious stones, and a strong and beautiful horse, as a present for the king, with which he came before the king and bowed down to the earth before him. And the king, his servants, and all the inhabitants of Egypt wondered at the work of Ricaon, and they saw his riches and the present that he had brought to the king. And it greatly pleased the king, and he wondered at it. And when Ricaon sat before him, the king asked him concerning all his works. And Ricaon spoke all his words wisely before the king, his servants, and all the inhabitants of Egypt. And when the king heard the words of Ricaon and his wisdom, Ricaon found grace in his sight. And he met with grace and kindness from all the servants of the king and from all the inhabitants of Egypt, on account of his wisdom and excellent speeches. And from that time they loved him exceedingly. And the king answered and said to Ricaon, Thy name shall no more be called Ricaon, but Pharaoh shall be thy name, since thou didst exact a tax from the dead. And he called his name Pharaoh. And the king and his subjects loved Ricaon for his wisdom. And they consulted with all the inhabitants of Egypt to make him prefect under the king. And all the inhabitants of Egypt and its wise men did so, and it was made a law in Egypt. And they made Ricaon Pharaoh prefect under Ahasuerus king of Egypt. And Ricaon Pharaoh governed over Egypt, daily administering justice to the whole city. But Ahasuerus the king would judge the people of the land one day in the year, when he went out to make his appearance. And Ricaon Pharaoh cunningly usurped the government of Egypt, and he exacted a tax from all the inhabitants of Egypt. And all the inhabitants of Egypt greatly loved Ricaon Pharaoh. And they made a decree to call every king that should reign over them and their seat in Egypt, Pharaoh. Therefore all the kings that reigned in Egypt from that time forward were called Pharaoh unto this day. Wow, so now we have just discovered why we know Egypt to have pharaohs and not kings to this day. We can also determine why the meaning of Pharaoh is defined as harsh catfish or fierce catfish. He actually catfished the people, someone who came from a distant land. Ricaon was able to unify the people when he usurped the government. In addition, he was extremely harsh on the people with his multiple tax policies. If you continue to read in chapter 15 in the book of Jasher, you will learn that Ricaon, the first Pharaoh, gave to Abraham his daughter Hagar the Egyptian, who becomes the mother of Ishmael. Pharaoh also gives to Abraham Eleazar, Abraham's servant that is known for going back to Abraham's homeland of Uz to get Isaac's bride Rebekah. These books add the missing puzzle pieces that allow these Bible stories to really come to life, so that we get a full understanding of Scripture. I will put a link down in the description box if you are interested in purchasing these books to add to your library. I hope to continue to bring these types of stories where the historical and the biblical account come together. If you are interested in this type of content, be sure to join the family by pressing that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, Shalom family.